There is a malfunction running silently inside you right now. Not in your body, not in your circumstances. In the very system that determines what your body does, what your circumstances become, and what you will ultimately make of your one available existence. Most people never locate this malfunction because they are too busy blaming the output for what is wrong with the process. They look at their results, the stagnant finances, the fractured relationships, the career that never quite ignites, the persistent sensation of living slightly below their actual capacity, and they assume the problem lives there in those results. They patch the surface. They adjust their schedule. They buy a new method. They read a new book. They do everything except go to the source, which is where every structural failure actually originates. The source is your mind, and your mind, left uncalibrated, left unexamined, left to run on its default factory settings, will produce the exact same outputs it has always produced, regardless of how many external variables you rearrange around it. This is not philosophy. This is metallurgy. A metallurgist does not guess at what a metal will do. A metallurgist knows with absolute precision that the properties of any alloy, its tensile strength, its conductivity, its resistance to fracture under load, are determined entirely by what happened to it at the molecular level during the forging process. The temperature it was exposed to, the pressure it was placed under, the rate at which it was cooled, the elements it was combined with. Change any one of those variables, and you change the nature of the metal itself. You change what it can hold. You change what it will bend under. You change whether it becomes the structural beam in a bridge that carries thousands of lives, or the brittle casting that shatters on first contact with real weight. The metal does not choose its properties randomly. Those properties were engineered deliberately or by default in the forge. And here is the truth that most people are not calibrated to receive. Your mind was forged in exactly the same way. Every belief you carry about your capacity, every assumption you hold about what is possible for someone like you, every reflexive response you have to challenge, to rejection, to failure, to opportunity, these were not born with you. They were forged in the early temperatures of your experience, shaped by the pressures of your environment, solidified during the cooling periods of repetition. And whatever alloy was produced in that process is now the foundational material you are building your entire life with. This is the architecture of the problem. Not that you lack opportunity, not that the world is unfair, not that the timing is wrong. The problem is that most people are attempting to construct the life of a high tensile alloy while operating entirely from a composition that was never designed for that kind of structural load. The forge is not a metaphor for suffering. The forge is a metaphor for the formative process that happens to every human mind, whether it is consciously directed or not. In industrial metallurgy, when a craftsman does not control the forging conditions, the resulting material is unpredictable. It might work, it might not. Its performance under real-world stress is essentially a gamble. That is precisely the condition most adults find themselves in. Their minds were forged without governance, by accident, by default, by whatever temperatures and pressures happen to be present in their early environments. And now they are attempting to perform, to build, to endure, to expand, using a mental composition that was never deliberately engineered for those purposes. Here is the first universal law of this system. The composition of your mind is not fixed, but it behaves as if it is until you apply heat again. In metallurgy, once metal has been forged and cooled, it holds its shape reliably, consistently. It becomes, in the language of materials science, stable. But stable does not mean permanent. Stable means it will not change on its own under ordinary conditions. To alter a forged metal, you must return it to the forge. You must apply sufficient heat to bring it back to a state of malleability. You must then introduce whatever elements are missing and apply controlled pressure before the cooling process locks the new composition in place. The human mind operates under an identical law. The neural patterns you have developed, your habitual thought structures, your default interpretations, your automatic responses are stable. They will not shift simply because life becomes uncomfortable or because you rationally understand they are limiting you. They require a deliberate, sustained application of enough internal heat to re-enter a state of malleability. That heat is not suffering. That heat is intentional attention. It is the consistent, disciplined act of placing your thought processes under conscious examination before they are permitted to govern your behavior. A person who spent years operating inside a belief system that told them they were not technically capable discovered this law not through inspiration, but through structural necessity. After repeatedly producing results that contradicted their actual competence, they were forced to examine not the results, but the forge. What they found was not a lack of intelligence or a lack of effort, but a belief installed in childhood. One conversation with an authority figure, one moment of public failure, one comparison drawn at exactly the wrong developmental temperature that had cooled into a permanent interpretive framework. Everything that came after was filtered through that framework. Every challenge became evidence. Every setback was confirmation. The metal had been forged in that shape, and until they returned it to the heat of deliberate self-examination and applied the pressure of consistent contradictory evidence over time, the shape would hold. They returned it to the forge. The composition changed. The outputs changed, not overnight, but with the irreversibility that only genuine structural change produces. The application of this law is exact. You must identify the specific belief compositions that are governing your outputs right now, not the general ones, not the surface discomforts. The specific core alloy, the fundamental assumption about your worth, your capacity, your deserving, that is shaping every decision, every risk tolerance, every relationship dynamic in your current life. Write it down in one sentence. That sentence is your forge temperature. That is where the work begins. The second law operates at the level of impurities. In metallurgy, the presence of certain trace elements at concentrations below visible detection can destroy the performance of an entire alloy. A fraction of a percentage of sulfur in steel makes it brittle under pressure. You cannot see it, you cannot feel it until the moment of fracture, but it is there and it is doing structural damage continuously. The mind carries the equivalent of sulfur, small, deeply embedded thought patterns that are invisible during ordinary functioning, but that fracture the metal under load. These are not the obvious negative thoughts you are aware of and working on. Those are the large-scale impurities you can see. These are the trace-level beliefs. The micro-assumption that other people's approval determines your legitimacy, the fractional belief that success requires permission from an external authority, the sub-threshold conviction that ambition is somehow unseemly or dangerous. These trace elements are doing catastrophic structural work because they operate below the level of your conscious governance. An individual who had consistently risen to a certain level in every domain they entered: business, relationships, physical health, and then inexplicably plateaued before reaching their stated objective, discovered upon sustained examination that a trace level impurity was producing the fracture. Not fear of failure. Fear of success was not even the right diagnosis. The actual impurity was a sub-threshold belief that becoming too large, too successful, too visible, too capable would constitute a betrayal of the environment that formed them, an unconscious loyalty to a particular composition of life. The impurity was invisible until the load became heavy enough to fracture the structure. Locating it required not motivation, but the kind of forensic precision a metallurgist applies to failure analysis. The application is this: the next time you encounter your own ceiling, your own plateau, your own moment of inexplicable resistance at the threshold of the next level, do not push harder. Analyze the fracture. Apply the forensic lens to the moment of failure rather than attempting to overcome it through force. Force against an impurity does not remove it, it accelerates the fracture. The removal of trace level mental impurities requires the controlled heat of honest self-interrogation, not the blunt force of willpower. The third law concerns the phenomenon of work hardening. This is one of the most important and least understood properties in material science. When certain metals are subjected to mechanical deformation, to stress, pressure, impact, without sufficient heat to restructure them, they do not weaken, they harden. The crystalline structure becomes denser, the metal becomes stronger in direct proportion to the pressure applied to it up to a specific threshold. Beyond that threshold, however, work-hardened metal becomes brittle in a different and more dangerous way. It becomes resistant to further deformation. It loses its adaptive capacity. It can no longer be shaped by ordinary means. And in this condition, it is vulnerable to sudden catastrophic fracture under the kind of impact it once absorbed effortlessly. The human mind that has been subjected to sustained pressure without restructuring, without the application of deliberate self-examination, without the integration of new frameworks, without the synthesis of experience into wisdom, undergoes a cognitive equivalent of work hardening. It becomes rigid. It becomes, in a very specific sense, confident in all the wrong ways, certain, closed, unable to receive the kind of new information that would require it to reshape its internal structure. You know this mind, you may live in it, or you may have encountered it. The mind so shaped by accumulated pressure and unprocessed experience that it has become impervious to new data, not because the intelligence is absent, but because the structure has exceeded its adaptive range. The work-hardened mind is not a stupid mind. It is often an experienced mind, a confident mind, a mind with genuine competence in specific domains. But its crystalline structure has become so dense that it can no longer integrate information that conflicts with its established composition. This is the mind that cannot learn from failure because it has already constructed a permanent interpretation of every failure. This is the mind that cannot receive genuine feedback because feedback is immediately processed as attack. This is the mind that knows with certainty that it has already figured out the important things, precisely because the pressure of not having figured them out has been too great to sustain. The application is a discipline of deliberate softening. Returning the work-hardened mind to the forge means introducing controlled vulnerability, not indiscriminate openness, but the targeted willingness to hold your most certain beliefs lightly enough to examine them, not permanently, not as a way of dissolving your convictions, as a periodic structural maintenance practice. The metallurgist anneals work-hardened metal by heating it to a specific temperature and allowing it to cool slowly, relieving the internal stresses without losing the structural gains. The mental equivalent is the practice of deliberately seeking contrary evidence for your most settled convictions, sitting with the discomfort of not immediately resolving the contradiction and allowing your framework to incorporate the tension rather than expelling it. This is not weakness. This is the maintenance of a mind that remains structurally capable under increasing loads. The fourth law is the law of alloy composition. A pure metal is rarely the optimal material for any complex application. Pure iron is too soft for structural use. Pure aluminum cracks under repeated stress. The metals that perform at the highest levels, that form the spines of aircraft, the cores of precision instruments, the load-bearing structures of civilization's most ambitious constructions are alloys. Combinations of elements, each contributing a specific property, the total composition exceeding what any single element could achieve alone. The mind that produces exceptional results in the real world is never a single element composition. It is an alloy. It contains the element of rigorous analytical capability combined with the element of intuitive synthesis. It contains the hardness of discipline combined with the ductility of creative thought. It contains the tensile strength of long horizon patience combined with the conductivity of present moment responsiveness. None of these properties in isolation produces superior performance. The purely analytical mind without intuition is slow and brittle in dynamic environments. The purely disciplined mind without creative flexibility repeats precise patterns into obsolescence. The alloy mind, the mind that has been deliberately composed of complementary elements, is the mind capable of sustaining performance across the full range of demands that a significant life will place upon it. A team in a high-performance environment had collectively discovered this through failure. Each individual was exceptional by single-element standards. One had extraordinary strategic intelligence. One had remarkable interpersonal sensitivity. One had disciplined execution capacity beyond what the environment had seen before. But the team underperformed in every composite challenge. The analysis revealed that each person was operating from a pure element composition, never integrating their capabilities into a single alloy, never allowing the heat of genuine collaboration to fuse their distinct properties into something structurally superior. When they learned to operate as an alloy, when each individual expanded their mental composition to incorporate and synthesize the properties around them, rather than defending the purity of their own single element, structural performance of the collective transformed. The law applies identically at the individual level. The question of mental alloy composition is not about what you are naturally. It is about what elements you are deliberately introducing into your mental forge to create a composition that exceeds your default. Now, the weight of this shifts from the theoretical to the load-bearing, because there is a very specific trap that sophisticated thinking about the mind creates, and it is this: a person can understand all of these laws with extraordinary clarity, can articulate the metallurgy of the mind in precise and sophisticated language, can even teach it with authority, and change nothing about their actual composition. Understanding a law and implementing a law are not the same forge temperature. They are not even in the same building. Understanding creates the blueprint. Implementing requires the heat. And most people, when confronted with the actual friction of returning their composition to the forge, the genuine discomfort, the identity level disruption, the sustained effort of living deliberately rather than by default, make a quiet, unannounced decision to remain in the shape they are in. They dress this decision in language that sounds like wisdom. They call it acceptance. They call it authenticity. They say they are working on themselves, when what they mean is they have become comfortable studying the problem without sustaining the cost of solving it. The responsibility is entirely yours now, not partially, not in proportion to your circumstances or your history or the temperatures you were forged under without your consent. Entirely. Because the moment you understand that your mental composition is not fixed, that it is subject to the same laws that govern every physical material in the universe, that it can be returned to the forge, that its impurities can be identified and removed, that its adaptive range can be maintained, that its elemental composition can be deliberately expanded. That moment eliminates every legitimate excuse for remaining in the current shape. The forge is available, the heat is available. The only variable remaining is whether you will apply it. Here is what application looks like in the specific, time-bound, operationally precise language that converts principle into structural change. In the next 24 hours, not next week, not when your circumstances improve, not when you finish reading everything you're reading. You will do one thing. You will write down in a single sentence the mental composition that is producing the result you most want to change in your life right now. Not a symptom, the composition. Not I am not successful enough, the composition. I believe that my level of effort will never be sufficient relative to what is required to reach the outcome I actually want. That composition, that specific alloy, write it in the language of belief, not circumstance. Once you have that sentence, you have located your forge. You have identified the metal that needs to return to the heat. The 24-hour action is not to fix it. It is to name it with total structural honesty. The 30-day calibration is where the actual forge work happens. Over the next 30 days, you will apply one deliberate heat source to that name composition every single day without exception. Not a grand intervention, not a complete identity overhaul, a single specific daily action that places the name belief under controlled pressure. If the composition is, I believe consistent action is not available to me, the heat source is one non-negotiable 5-minute daily action in the domain where that belief operates. Not to prove the belief wrong, to introduce enough contradictory molecular evidence that the composition begins to soften. On day 1, this will feel largely irrelevant. On day 7, you will feel the resistance of the work-hardened structure pushing back. On day 14, if you have not deviated, you will begin to detect a shift in the forge temperature, a mild but unmistakable sense that the composition is becoming less certain of itself. By day 30, if the heat has been applied consistently, you will not have a new composition, but you will have a malleable one. And a malleable composition is the precondition for every structural transformation that follows. The 90-day synthesis is the alloy building phase. Having softened the primary limiting composition and introduced consistent, contradictory evidence at the behavioral level, you now deliberately introduce the missing element. You identify the specific metal property your current composition lacks, the element that, when added, would produce the alloy you require for the structural demands ahead. This requires the kind of precise self-knowledge that most people are uncomfortable cultivating because it demands the admission that your current composition, however competent in some domains, is specifically incomplete in the domain that matters most for your next level of performance. Identify the missing element, then engineer your environment to expose you to that element daily through the people you spend time with, through the material you consume, through the problems you deliberately choose to engage. This is not passive influence. This is the deliberate introduction of a new element into the forge. 90 days of sustained exposure at sufficient concentration will begin the alloying process. The composition will change. The outputs will follow, not as motivation, not as inspiration, as physics. The mind that governs your life is not a mystery. It is not beyond your governance. It is not immune to the laws of the universe that govern every material system in existence. It was forged. It can be reforged. Its impurities can be located with forensic precision. Its adaptive range can be maintained through deliberate practice. Its composition can be expanded beyond the default elements with which it entered the world. The life you are living right now is the exact, structurally inevitable output of the mental alloy you are currently running. Not a judgment, a law. And if the output is not what the blueprint calls for, the answer is never to rearrange the output. The answer is to return to the forge. The only life you will not be able to change is the one you refuse to heat.